Greetings, literary themes and poetry students. Welcome to yet another video lecture module for our class. Today we'll be focusing on one of the great odes written by John Keats in the early 1800s, entitled Ode on a Grecian Urn. Before I start talking about this poem, I'm going to foreground my discussion with a brief introduction to the theme of Romanticism, the literary movement of Romanticism. Keats is one of the high Romantic poets of the early 19th century in England. Romanticism was a literary movement that was a reaction to neoclassicism. In the late 18th century, neoclassicism was a dominant mode defined by a preference for reason and order and structure, rationality, and things like that. Romanticism is a poetic and philosophical reaction to neoclassicism. It basically believes, the Romantics believe that rationalism and order and structure are perhaps important, but they're not the only things. And Romanticism comes to embrace things like emotions, dreams, irrationality, the sublime, subjectivity, and things like that. And so the Romantics tend to break with the traditions of the neoclassicists. They move from a very formalized, highly structured diction to a much simpler, less rigid structure, certainly. And many of the poems also take on a much simpler, more less overtly poetic language and more conversational in tone. One of the next poems that we're going to look at, William Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, is a great example of that. And so the Romantic poets were, the most famous English Romantic poets were William Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge, who began the movement really with an essay they wrote, which was actually a preface to a book of poems that they wrote together called Lyrical Ballads. And the preface to Lyrical Ballads, which came out originally in 1798, was kind of like a manifesto of what Romantic poetry would be, talking about a simple language approaching the language of the common man, where poetry, they believed that the neoclassicists had made poetry kind of inaccessible, and elitist, and exclusive domain that they were not in favor of. And so these poets, as I said, Wordsworth, Coleridge, first and foremost, and then another wave of Romantics, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Lord Byron, and John Keats. There's a handful of other important ones, but those are the ones that we're going to focus on initially anyways. And so the Romantics, and once again, I come back to the etymology of that term, because we've seen chivalric romance previously in the semester, which was a literary form, medieval literary form, having to do with quest literature, and it's where courtly love had its origins. We also see romance in the sense of love, and these words, they all have a common etymological origin, but they do not share a meaning. And so if you see romantic, romance, Roman, Romanesque, all of those, although derived from Rome, the city in Italy, directly and indirectly, often have a different meaning. And so romantic and romanticism, the adjectival and nominal forms here, both do not really relate to love. The term was initially pejorative. These poets did not call themselves romantics, but other poets and critics who were looking at what they wrote called them that term, and it was slightly disparaging. It was not exactly a respectful term. They thought that they were lighthearted, frivolous, and lacking in seriousness. Interestingly, historically speaking, in literary history, the Romantics aged pretty well because Keats, Shelley, Wordsworth, Byron, Coleridge are much, much more important in the literary canon of English history than many of the neoclassicists who preceded them, and certainly than many of the critics who derided them in the way that they spoke about them. So that's a backdrop to this poem and to these poets. As I said, we'll be looking at a couple of them in the upcoming class periods. So we start, as I said, with Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. An Ode on a Grecian Urn is one of 6 great odes that Keats wrote in 1819. One of the important things about Keats is that he was a prolific poet, but he died very young. He died at age 24 of tuberculosis. And so some of the poems that he wrote in the last years of his life have a certain force and intensity to them. Part of that has to do with his awareness of his mortality. Tuberculosis was a communicative disease, pulmonary disease. In this moments that we're living with the coronavirus, it was also highly contagious. And once you had it, it was known as consumption also, and you tended to waste away. And so people would start to weaken, and eventually they would cough up blood and become weaker and weaker and eventually die. This is what happened to Keats. He actually died in Italy. You can visit his grave. I actually did visit his grave last summer in Rome. He's buried in the Protestant cemetery in Rome. And he was trying to get away from England and going to Italy for the climate to help heal himself. But he was obviously aware that he was dying. And the reason I say that is because in several of the great odes, these 6 odes that he wrote in a relatively short period of time, the theme of mortality and immortality come up repeatedly. Perhaps when you read this poem, you were aware of that. I hope you were aware of it, because one of the big themes of this poem is precisely the idea that perhaps human beings can transcend the physical limits of their life through the potentials and the power of artistic creation. This is a theme we've seen repeatedly. We can go back thinking, most specifically probably Shakespeare, neither marble nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful rhyme, where the poem itself is actually a mechanism for the poet and the poet's message to transcend the temporal limits of human life, which are relatively short. I mean, even if you're really lucky, you're not going to live, if you make it to 100, you should be very, very happy, and you're not going to make it much further than that, even under the best of circumstances. So the sense that there's this physical and temporal limit to our lives has very often been a theme for poets. As I said, Shakespeare confronts it. A number of other poets that we've seen do as well. A number of them that we'll look at in the coming weeks will do it as well. And in fact, the poem that we're going to look at today, Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, also does that. So we can think about perhaps what might have been motivating a young man at the height of his poetic powers, probably, but also aware that his life was possibly not going to last as long as he would have hoped it to. And so how that might color the type of poem that he wrote. So this particular poem is, as I said, an ode An ode is a traditional, it's a ceremonious lyrical poem that typically addresses and often celebrates either a person, a place, a thing, or an idea. Some of the odes that Keats wrote in that great sequence, Ode to Autumn, Ode to a Nightingale, and this one, Ode on a Grecian Urn, are among the most famous. The tradition dates back to the Greeks. The great Greek poet Pindar was famous for writing his odes, which were typically public poems. Usually they were set to music to celebrate a particular event. As I said, the tradition is taken up by a number of poets, and in 1819, Keats had the inspiration to write what are known as his 6 great odes, and this is one of them. The ode, actually, this particular one, is what's known as an ekphrasis, which is a Greek word used to denote a description of a work of art, an extended description. And of course, coming back to the poem entitled Ode on a Grecian Urn, we can understand that this is, in fact, an ekphratic poem as well, an ekphratic ode. And we basically have a situation where the speaker in the poem is confronting, as the title mentions, a Grecian urn. People have speculated about the title of the poem because is it an ode on a Grecian urn? In other words, speaking about a Grecian urn, or someone has, several critics have mentioned, perhaps the more appropriate title would be Ode to a Grecian Urn, because it almost feels as if there is a conversation going on between the persona and the urn. Excuse me. And so this particular ode is also what's known as an apostrophe. You're getting lots of terminology today. An apostrophe is a direct address to a person, or in this case, a thing. And we see within this poem that Keats is, in fact, directly addressing the urn, speaking to the urn. The first lines of the poem reiterate that. We see the use of the word thou, Thou. Thou, as we've said previously, is an archaic form of you. And it's in a case when I use the word you, I'm typically speaking to a person. In this case, Keats is speaking to the urn. So the poem begins, "Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme. What leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape, of deities or mortals or of both, in Tempe or the dales of Arcady? What men or gods are these? What maidens loath? What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pipes and timbrels? What wild ecstasy?" The first stanza is quite interesting for a number of reasons. That first line, "Thou still unravished bride of quietness," it's very curious phrasing. An unravished bride, that implies a bride who has not yet had to be ravished, is to be sort of possessed, taken control of. It's probably a sexual term in this case. And so we have the unravished bride, meaning that the bride has not yet been, the marriage to the bride has not been consummated, probably. And so the unravished bride of quietness is implying that there's a woman waiting for a man. She's a bride, she's married, but it's between the act of the wedding and perhaps the honeymoon, let's say. Thou still unravished bride, still has a double sense. Still meaning ongoing, right? It's still the case. It was the case yesterday, and it's still the case today, but still also has the connotation or the sense of not moving, right? If something is still, it is static. And so you have both senses here. You have the still unravished bride. She hasn't been ravished yet. And you also have the still unmoving, unravished bride, of quietness. Thou foster child of silence and slow time. These are all curious phrasings because the what's being spoken about is the urn, and I guess maybe it makes sense to talk a little bit about an urn. An urn is typically a ceramic object used often for burial. Very often ashes are put in it. Actually, the previous poem that we studied, if you remember correctly, Derek Walcott's Ruins of a Great House, began with an epigraph, and the epigraph came from a poem by Thomas Browne called Urn Burial. That's just a kind of a curious little fact, but the urn is typically ceramic, as I said. It's an object, and it usually contains something inside it, so it's a container. In this particular case, it's a Grecian urn, so it comes from Greece, probably from ancient Greece. Another perhaps curious, you won't think it's that curious perhaps, but a fact is that at the time that Keats had written this poem, he had recently seen what are known as the Elgin marbles. The Elgin marbles are friezes from the Parthenon in Greece that a person by the name of Lord Elgin had taken from Greece, from Athens, and he'd brought them back to England. They actually sit today in the British Museum in London. And if there were not a giant quarantine and everyone were being locked in their houses for the next however many months, you could get on a plane and go to the British Museum in London, which, by the way, is free. You don't have to pay to get in. It's one of the great museums in the world. I encourage you to go there if you get the chance. And you can see the Elgin marbles. And the Elgin marbles, or what are also known as the Parthenon friezes, are some of the greatest marble sculpture works from ancient Greece. And it's a bit of a contentious issue that someone by the name of Lord Elgin, who was a nobleman, a British nobleman, came in and decided that he could leave with probably one of the greatest artistic patrimonial objects of Greece, and he brought it back to London. And to this day, there's a whole bit of a discussion about whether or not the British people have the right, and the British Museum has the right to maintain possession of those objects, and maybe they should be repatriated. In Greece, in Athens, they've recently constructed a beautiful new museum that is dedicated to the Parthenon and the Acropolis and that whole hill of great temples in central Athens. And the hope is perhaps that someday those great marbles will be returned to their rightful home, probably. Anyways, that's neither here nor there. That's a different discussion, although it's one that matters perhaps for this poem and a couple other poems we're going to see. This idea of art and art appreciation, as I said, ekraxis, that we, if we look at, ekphrasis, if we look at that type of poem that conjures the work of art, and this particular poem conjuring this particular work of art is in some ways inspired by Keats's encounters with the Elgin marbles. And so his fascination with the imagery on the urn is very, very prominently portrayed. So we have an urn, and we have a bunch of images, pictures on the side of it. And mostly what the poem is the speaker confronting this urn and confronting these images and trying to make sense of them. You probably noticed at the end of that first stanza that I read, and when you read it, if you looked, what leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape of deities or mortals of both, in Tempe or the dales of Arcady? What men or gods are these? What maidens loath? What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pipes and timbrels? What wild ecstasy? Each one of those lines ends with a question mark. Those are questions. And so with the exception of the first couple statements of the stanza, everything else in the stanza is a series of questions being posed to the urn, or more specifically, about the urn. So the first stanza classifies the urn, a still unravished bride of quietness, a bride, thou foster child of silence and slow time, a foster child, kind of a curious, different familial relationship, sylvan historian, who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme. He's an historian as well. Sylvan means of the forest, and so we have immediately in here the beginnings of kind of a pastoral image. If you remember when we looked back at the beginning of the semester at pastoral poetry, where we valorize the rustic lifestyle, in this opening stanza we have a number of references that situate this poem within some pastoral tradition. A sylvan historian, okay, a person who is a historian of the countryside, leaf-fringed legend, Tempe or the Dales of Arcady. If you remember when we talked about pastoral poetry, Arcadia, when Theocritus founded the form, those were typically set in a place called Arcadia, which was this idyllic, Edenic place that was associated very closely with the joys of the natural world. And then we also have the image of the shepherds, the pipes and timbrels, right? The instruments associated with the shepherd, if you remember, going back to Marlowe's pastoral poem, The Passionate Shepherd to His Love, where we have the person playing these flutes, and those are typically the image associated with the shepherd, and that is, again, the central element of pastoral poetry. So we have a whole series of almost reiterated statements about the urn. It's addressed as a bride, a foster child, a historian. It talks about the story that it can tell. It can express a flowery tale more sweetly than a rhyme. It's compared with actually the poem itself, and it's even given a higher priority, right? That the story that the urn tells might be even better than the story that the poem tells about the urn. And then it finishes with a series, as I said, of questions. Now, of course, there are questions, but there are no answers. You have a question followed by another question, followed by another question. And so it's this accretion of questions, but of course you can ask a lot of questions. If you don't get any answers, it's not clear that your understanding advances so much. The next stanza begins, heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore ye soft pipes play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared. Pipe to the spirit ditties of no tune. Fair youth, beneath the trees thou canst not leave thy song, nor ever can those trees be bare. Bold lover, never, never canst thou kiss, though winning near the goal, yet do not grieve. She cannot fade, though thou hast not yet thy bliss. Forever wilt thou love, and she be fair. Once again, we've encapsulated a number of the central themes associated with pastoral poetry, in particular, timelessness. Remember, one of the key things about Eden and Arcadia by extension, but Eden in specifics, is that it precedes the prelapsarian mode, precedes the original sin, and men and women will live forever. And so here you have this sense of timelessness. It's associated quickly with the pipes and timbrels of the previous stanza. Pipes and timbrels are instruments. Then the stanza begins, heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Okay, now what does that mean exactly? Here he's starting to engage with the images on the side of the urn. And you have the image of somebody playing music, a shepherd perhaps, somebody with pipes and timbrels, and we can imagine that music. And certainly the music that we hear is of a certain type, but the music that we imagine when we look at something of someone playing music is obviously going to be something different. And here he's making, again, a comparison. Previously he compared the urn to the poem in the first stanza. Now he's comparing the music that one hears to the music that one imagines. He talks about pipe to the spirit ditties of no tone. fair youth beneath the trees. Okay, we have a young person, and here clearly we have a couple. The bold lover, never, never canst thou kiss, though winning near the goal, yet do not grieve, she cannot fade. So you have the lover pursuing the beloved. Okay, you have a young man and a young woman, presumably here, and they are perhaps reaching to embrace, okay, but they'll never get there, okay? And this is one of the central issues of the poem, is that what's happening on the urn is frozen in time. It's timeless. Again, we're talking about an urn from the days of ancient Greece, right? If you go into a museum, you can see these urns, and you'll see pictures on the sides of them, and those pictures are, thousands of years old. They haven't really changed. I mean, they might change in the sense that they're worn or they can be broken, but the actual image on the side doesn't evolve, right? It's not like a moving picture or something. So the man chasing the woman here is frozen. And though he's getting near his goal being to kiss her, he will never get the goal. He will never achieve that because they're frozen in time where they are. But there's actually a virtue to that. She cannot fade, though thou hast not thy bliss. Forever wilt thou love, and she be fair. Once again, if you remember to some of the early love poetry that we saw in the semester, that issue of time and time being kind of an enemy, here time is not an enemy. In fact, we can see that the urn kind of transcends time. There's a sense of timelessness. And when it says, forever wilt thou love, and she be fair, right? She's not going to be fair. She's going to be beautiful because she's going to stay young, right? She's not going to age. Happy, happy boughs that cannot shed your leaves, nor ever bid the spring adieu, and happy melodist unwearied, forever piping songs forever new. More happy love, more happy, happy love, forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever panting and forever young, all breathing passion far above, that leaves a heart high sorrowful and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. Same themes are reiterated again here. Timelessness, okay? Forever piping songs forever new, forever warm and still to be enjoyed, okay? Never bid the spring adieu. The spring, remember, the season associated with youth. It's always going to be spring, much like coming back to Marlowe's poem when he mentioned that they're always going to have this beautiful temperate time. Raleigh immediately replies saying, well, eventually it becomes winter and eventually spring fades, but here the spring and the leaves, the leaves on the tree will not fall. Happy, happy boughs that cannot shed your leaves. The leaves will stay there forever, a sign both of fertility, fecundity, but also a sign of youth. Never bid the spring adieu. Okay, never say goodbye. It's going to be there forever. The songs will stay the same. The melodist, the person playing the music, unwearied, will never become tired. Okay, and so all of this is frozen in time, and the reason it's frozen in time is because the image on the side of the urn is fixed. It is static. It will never age. But there's something slightly wrong with that, and the latter part of the stanza mentions forever panting and forever young. Okay, panting as in exerting oneself and exerting energy, and young, right? Vital, dynamic, even as it's fixed on the side of the earth. All breathing human passion far above, that leaves a heart high sorrowful and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. Here we get into the elements of passion, and of course passion implies life and vitality, and all of that is somewhere else, far away. So the urn doesn't quite encompass that, or it encompasses it in a static, frozen moment. So frozen vitality is somewhere else. All breathing human passion far above. It's not there. It's somewhere else. The following stanza returns to the pattern that we saw in the first stanza, posing questions, right? Posing questions without answers. Who, what, why, okay? Those question words that begin the statements. Who are these coming to the sacrifice? To what green altar, O mysterious priest, leadst thou that heifer lowing at the skies, and all her silken flanks with garlands dressed? What little town by river or seashore, or mountain built with peaceful citadel, is emptied of this folk, this pious morn? And little town, thy streets for evermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou art desolate, can e'er return. Okay? Each of those statements is, in fact, not a statement, but an interrogative, a question. So, who are these coming to the sacrifice? Okay? There's an image of a sacrifice, a ritual sacrifice. The Greeks tended to sacrifice animals to their gods. And here we have a heifer, a cow, that is lowing to the skies, that's making noise, and is decked with silken flanks with garlands dressed. So the cow has been put all sorts of colorful fabrics and threads to embellish the heifer that's being brought to this sacrifice. And he's wondering, who are these people going to the sacrifice? What is the altar? The mysterious priest, okay? There's all this rituals that are expressed on the urn, but of course the speaker doesn't quite know what they mean. And probably if you go to a museum and you see a Grecian urn, you probably have a similar experience, maybe not identical to what's happening within this poem, but the sense of when you go to a museum and you try to interpret a piece of art, as I said, the whole tradition of ekphrastic art, that you are looking at something from another time, from another place. Perhaps you like it, perhaps you don't like it, but the experience of visiting a museum is precisely one of trying to understand. The reason why it's a worthwhile thing to do is that you can broaden your understanding of different things. And particularly if you become a little bit knowledgeable, if you start to learn about Greek culture and you learn about their polytheistic, anthropomorphic deities and the rituals associated with that, then you may see something that is portrayed and you may have a frame of reference in order to interpret it. That's neither here nor there for the purposes of the poem. The speaker in the poem is looking at what is happening on the urn and trying to make sense of it. But the act of making sense of it is reduced to this inquisitive quality, asking question after question after question. And so we have the people going to the sacrifice, the altar that they're going to, the cow that's being led there. All of these things are unclear to the speaker, what is happening, or why. Maybe he's aware of what is happening, but he's not clear of the context and why it's happening. What little town by river or shore or mountain built with peaceful citadel is emptied of this folk, this pious morn, right? So he's imagining the situation where all the people have left the town. The town might be in the background, and they're coming in this procession, bringing this cow to this altar, a sacred space that will perhaps lead to the sacrifice. But he wants to know, who are these people? What are they doing? Why are they doing this? And little town, thy streets for evermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou art desolate, can e'er return. Okay? And here we come back to the reality of the urn. That little town that he's looking at is silent because it's not really a little town. It's an artistic rendering of a little town. And what we have in the context of the poem and on the side of this urn is something that will never really share its secrets. It's going to be silent in the same way that the urn has been silent. It hasn't been answering its questions. It hasn't, the questions that the speaker is posing are being posed. And he's having, again, if we think of the context, if we look back, remembering Seamus Heaney's Punishment, which we recently examined, where the speaker in that poem is looking at a a body, preserved, mummified body, the Windaby Bog Girl, who was ritually killed thousands of years ago. And he's looking at that body and he is making an imaginative um, scenario of what he thinks happened when he sees that woman standing there, with her clothes off and with, frightened and being ready to be killed. He's imagining that from what he sees on the body, right? The fact that she has a blindfold and a noose and all these things. So he's making an interpretation of that. Similarly, in this poem, we have the speaker looking at the images and looking at the urn and perhaps turning around it. We don't know, looking at the various sides of it because it's obviously a three-dimensional object. He's rendering it in a poem, but so it's hard for us to get a sense of exactly what these images are. Probably they're painted on the side of the urn. Perhaps they're sculpted. Okay, we don't really have enough to go with to know precisely what that is, but you have a sense of it. And so the secrets of this work of art are going to be, to some extent, maintained, right? And so when he says, the little town, thy streets forevermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou art desolate, okay? The streets are empty, and nobody is going to tell us why, or at least the urn is not going to tell us why. As we move forward here into the final stanza, we get the sense once again of some of his exuberance. There's a certain level of enthusiasm in engaging with this. Oh, Attic shape, fair attitude with breed of marble men and maidens o'erwrought, with forest branches and the trodden weed, thou silent form dost tease us out of thought, as doth eternity, cold pastoral. When age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know. Okay? Here again we have the image of apostrophe, the direct address. There's something unusual here because the direct address is an urn, an inanimate object. Oh, Attic shape, okay, Attic relating to ancient Greece. Fair attitude, okay, with exclamation points. So the speaker here is expressing a certain level of enthusiasm and intensity about it, of marble men and maidens overwrought. Okay, here again we're commenting on the reality of the urn, whether these are not real men, okay, these are men and women that are portrayed on the side of the urn. Overwrought. Overwrought is kind of a curious word because it can mean sort of overwritten, okay? In other words, there are images on the outside of the urn, but overwrought can also mean overly emotional. And so he's coming back. We've sort of seen this scene in the earlier parts of the urn, of the poem. In the earlier stanzas, we have this pursuit. We have this still unravished bride of quietness. We have the bold lover pursuing his beloved. And there's this almost a sense of, it's not menace because we imagine it's a sanctioned reality, but there's a vitality and a dynamism to it that is pretty pervasive. And so the marble men and maidens overwrought can convey something of that story being told within the urn. With forest branches and the trodden weed. And once again, coming back, the branches in the forest and the weeds that people are stepping on, tromping down. So there's this sense of almost, it's not combative, but there's something confrontational in there in what's being portrayed within the urn. And again, the fact that these are questions and that what the speaker is doing is posing questions, but not necessarily answering the questions. So we have a whole bunch of information and material, but we don't know how to process it, which again mimics the experience of being in a museum and looking at an object and trying to interpret it. Thou silent form dost tease us out of thought, as doth eternity. Okay, once again, thou, the direct address, same as the beginning of the poem. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time. Here we have thou silent form. Okay, and so reiterating, we have this repetitive asking of questions, inquiries, inquisition, that does not get a response. Thou silent form dost tease us out of thought, as doth eternity. Okay, eternity, eternity. And so it's making us think about things, right? And this poem has life to it, time to it, and the urn also has this quality, transcending time. And that line finishes with the exclamation, cold pastoral. We've talked previously in the poem about the imagery of pastoral, the shepherds, the vines, the idea of the countryside, the leaves on the trees, and things like that. All of this Arcady, okay, Arcadia, all of the images of pastoral poetry. But here we have it, interestingly, curiously modified with the adjective cold. Why cold pastoral? And it's an interesting choice of an adjective. Why might that be an appropriate adjective here? Cold pastoral, because pastoral should have, again, this sense of the appreciation of the rustic life, and also built into it, baked into it, timelessness and eternity. But here there's something about the pastoral and the eternity that we might be getting to the heart of the meaning of the poem, because what is the type of transcendental eternity that we get in pastoral? It alludes to that, but actually for humans, we don't have that, because breathing, walking, active humans are not cold, they're warm, but they also are not timeless, they're mortal. And so you kind of have some of the complication at the end of the poem, and then I think it's stated very poignantly here. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man. Okay? When old age this generation waste, okay, the people around, the people of this moment, will eventually, you may be young now, but then old age will come, and eventually the generation will waste. In other words, the people will die. Thou shalt remain. And thou, again, the direct address, the apostrophe, is referring to the urn. The urn is timeless. Thou shalt remain in midst of other woe. So we have our woe now, and our woe is fairly large right now, with our coronavirus quarantine reality facing us. We have our woe, but in another time in the future, when old age this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man. Okay, so suddenly this urn, which has been a bride, a foster child, a historian, okay, now is a friend to man. And what is the nature of that friendliness? Is it a very intimate connection here? The speaker and the urn, this silent form that has really been just stoically sitting there, listening perhaps, we don't know. So, thou silent form dost tease us out of thought, as doth eternity, cold pastoral. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to who thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know. The poem, the ending of the poem is quite enigmatic. In other words, it's slightly difficult to understand. An enigma. It's not clear what it's saying. Okay, and of course, the most important element of the ending of the poem is that you have to parse those thou and what's happening. Thou shalt remain in midst of other woes than ours, a friend to man, to whom, and that to whom addresses man, thou, and thou is the urn, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. The final stanza and the final lines of the final stanza have the rather absurd or at least unusual situation where after the speaker in the poem has been repeatedly posing questions to the urn from the beginning, trying to understand what's happening with the urn, trying to make sense of what these images on the side, the sacrifice, the mad pursuit of the man chasing the woman, the musician playing, okay, all of these things that are there that he can see, that he can attempt to interpret. He's posed these questions and they just float in the air, right? When you ask a question and you're asking it to, an urn or, a chair, they probably are not going to answer. However, in this particular poem, the urn does answer, and the final lines of the poem are the urn responding to the questions of the speaker. Beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. Now again, that's, as I said, is slightly enigmatic riposte that the urn is making to the speaker. So he's been asking all of these questions. He's trying to interpret the meaning of what the urn is trying to say, and he comes up with this reality that beauty is truth. Beauty, we associate beauty often with art, often with physical beauty, but beauty is a subjective thing, and truth. And what is the relationship between truth and beauty? Now, it might be getting to the heart of aesthetics and artistic appreciation, coming back again to ekphrastic art, where we see the engagement with the work of art. This is actually this is what it is, that we are trying to get to the heart of what is beauty and actually what is truth, right? Now, language kind of falls short here because those are big words. It's like when, we've seen this previously in the semester when we're talking about love. Love is kind of hard. I mean, when we use the word love, we know what it's referring to, but it can refer to a broad array of things, and it's not very precise. If you just pull out the word love, it doesn't have necessarily much of a meaning except that we know it's a positive affection to feel for another person. Similarly, beauty is positive, physical beauty, or some aesthetic beauty, and truth, it is implied that it has a veracity to it, but it's just making that kind of relationship, right? X equals Y and Y equals X type relationship. Beauty is truth and truth is beauty. It doesn't give us much to work with. And then it's sort of dismissive that for human beings, the urn almost seems like it's taking a superior stance with respect to the speaker, that, this is all this is as much as I can tell you, or as much as you will be capable of comprehending. That is all ye know on earth. Ye, again, you. So the thou, the urn, is addressing the you, which becomes the speaker. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. That is sort of sufficient so that you have your subjective aesthetic appreciation of the object, and that becomes enough for you to take away. Now, as I said, the ending of this poem has kind of gotten a whole lot of critical play. If you want to go and look into some of the critical responses to this, you can definitely find a broad array of what people are saying, some of them quite technical and quite complex, some of them less so. But anyways, the takeaway on this poem is that Keats has written an ode on this object, this artistic object, and it deals a great deal with the idea of eternity and the immortality of the work of art that transcends human limits, the ones that we mortals have to face. So I hope that has enlightened you to some extent on Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, and certainly we will have the opportunity to address questions related to this poem in our video conference question and answer period. So with that, I bid you good day, and I will speak to you soon. Goodbye.